All right, folks, meat and potatoes. And once again, I welcome back my good mate, co-founder of Fuelin, Scott Tindal. Welcome back once again.
G'day, Maddie. Thanks for having me again.
I very much enjoyed last week. If you missed last week, listeners, it's a do not miss, particularly if you're an endurance athlete. We went through some questions, some quick fire, rapid questions that we ended up getting pretty deep into everything around or under the umbrella of race fueling and hydration. And so, if you're interested in that, I recommend you go back and listen to last week's show. This week, we're going to cut that off. We're not going to talk about race fueling and hydration. We're going to talk about fueling for life, basically. We're going to talk about daily performance. I don't know if you have a cute banner or title for that, but let's call it for daily performance. But it's also a huge topic, by the way, for athletes. And I think it's often the forgotten part, but of course it's absolutely critical. So this is for people showing up better in life. And we've got a great list of questions from our Purple Patch athletes as well as our listeners to this show that have been trickling in over the last 6 to 8 weeks. So we thought, well, we've got to get the man on himself and we've got to ask. So if your seatbelt is locked and loaded, are you ready to go, Captain?
Right, let's do it.
All right, I'm just going to fire them off, okay? We've got 6 or 7 of these questions that we're going to go through, and you and I can both be wordy, but let's see if we can be succinct and to the point. And this one's a great one. I love starting off with crackers, and it's one of my favorite because this is a really common question that I get. That's that I tend to get an energy slump right after lunch. So there's a person that's not specifically an athlete. I actually know who this is, but I'm not going to tell them. But are there any nutrition or hydration suggestions to try and fix that big energy slump? It makes it hard to work and be productive when I'm in this state.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Probably first and foremost, nothing to do with nutrition or hydration is get up, get active. Like just do some air squats, get the blood pumping, do some push-ups. I have a good friend who they started like a little push-up competition in their office. Whenever anyone got a little bit tired, they'd drop down and give 10. And it's amazing what that does when you're just sitting in front of your screen and you've eaten a meal, and especially if that meal's been a bit carb heavy, then you can get that bit of a slump because you'll get a rise in blood sugars, you'll get your insulin kick in, that will drop that down. That's natural. That's going to happen. That's expected. And then you're sitting down, you're probably going to feel a bit of lethargy. So get up, go for a walk, grab some stairs, go to the bubbler, fill up your water bottle, come back to your desk. You might find that instantly you're feeling a little bit better. So I'd probably go with that first and foremost. Now, the only thing I would say to that, maybe that energy slump relates to not having breakfast, especially if that carbohydrate meal was very big for that first meal of the day, having not had breakfast. And I think there is a question coming up that I glanced over, which relates to breakfast. So it might be a good segue into that.
It will, yeah. I just want to regurgitate, pardon the pun there, but because you really spotlight that, but get the body moving. I think that's great. I absolutely agree with that, and I really like, by the way, having a lunch and then going for a walk. It's really good. It's important hydration, like getting some fluids in there, getting the body moving, and then I just want to ask one little follow up question because can you just explain one more time for people that don't maybe understand the insulin response, what it is as a response to rising blood glucose? You talked about maybe eating a heavy carb. So imagine someone eats a big sandwich. What happens there in pretty simple terms, or at least as succinct as you can? It's worth, I think, listeners understanding what's going on there a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, you're eating carbohydrates. Carbohydrates broken down into the simplest form is glucose. That can cause some increases in blood sugars as people want to think about it. Your little pancreas will squeeze out some insulin. That will then result in blood sugars coming down. Again, simplifying it and pushing those blood sugars, back into the muscle, into the liver, and that is a normal response. And I think this is the problem with things like these continuous glucose monitors is people might eat a sandwich and see that level go up, that little line, and think, holy hell, that's not good. I'm pre-diabetic or something. It's like, no, it going up and coming down is a normal response. That's fantastic. Don't panic. That's what happens when you eat carbohydrates. It's a normal response. If it stays elevated for 2 hours or more after you eat that meal, okay, maybe you do have an issue now. But if it comes down within that 2 hour period after eating, that is a normal response. And so please don't panic if you are wearing a CGM. CGMs were created for pre diabetic or diabetic people, not necessarily athletes or people who are of a healthy body weight and are of good health.
Perfect. Great addition there. Thank you very much. Question two. You knew it was coming. It was great, and I was so glad my ears pricked up when you mentioned breakfast, because the next question is exactly that. How important is breakfast for daily performance and energy? I'm not a big fan of breakfast, and often waiting till mid morning or even lunch before I eat. This is an incredibly common question that I get. And in addition, I obviously observe as well a lot of media talking about the benefits of intermittent fasting and narrowing the eating window, people getting up and not having any calories until make it up 4 o'clock in the afternoon. So, how important is breakfast for daily performance and energy?
Yeah, I mean, look, again, context and there's caveats around all of this stuff. It's not black and white as most people would like to believe. There's the breakfast camp and there's the no breakfast camp, the fasting camp, as you say. I think first and foremost, fasting is a tool in the toolkit. If it allows you to consume less calories across the day and your goal is losing body weight or body fat, then potentially, and you consume a lower amount of calories in that small window in the afternoon before early evening, then yes, that could be beneficial. Again, the caveat to that is that if that first meal of the day contains carbohydrates, then your response to those carbohydrates is going to be greater than someone who ate carbohydrates for breakfast in the morning. So, if blood glucose control and being pre diabetic and things like that, if that's potentially something that you're concerned about, then a breakfast meal would be something to recommend and do. The other part to consider is if you are doing training in the morning. Now, I'm not talking about a walk or maybe even a 30-minute run, but if you're doing decent amount of training, let's say 60 minutes or more, then I would not be recommending that you're doing that training and then following a time restricted or an intermittent fasting protocol. Do your training in the afternoon when you've actually got some fuel in and around the body to help with prepping you and recovering. That would be otherwise, you're doing all this training and you're potentially just breaking down. And yes, in the short term, you might feel better, but what is it doing over the long period of time, which ultimately is what you have to do anyway in order to adapt and also get consistent weight loss. So there's sort of those points to think about. Um, yeah, that's probably where I'd leave it, to be honest.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, context is everything, and it's very different an approach to a pre-diabetic or diabetic type person as it relates to then trying to apply a similar principle to a training athlete. It just it doesn't correlate at all.
And that's, Maddie, that is such a good point because what you're getting in the media, they're cherry picking some information about a study. Now, what they often don't highlight is who the participants were in that study. They were probably middle aged, pre diabetic, obese, or overweight individuals with some health issues. And yes, going time restricted or intermittent fasting possibly helps that type of cohort. We're not talking about someone who is actively involved in a structured training session trying to do better at, say, a triathlon or a marathon or a swimming event or a cycling event. That's a very different perspective and needs to be considered by the athlete and the coach when you're talking to the athlete about that. And if you're doing swimming or weights first thing in the morning and then not eating either before or after that, that, in my opinion, and I'm pretty sure supported by majority of the scientific community, that you're probably doing yourself a disservice and certainly over a number of weeks are probably going to have some negative consequences as a result of that. So again, context is so specific. When you do read any of these articles or even abstracts around literature, which you might read in PubMed, go into the study and have a look at who the participants were, how many of them, um, what were their characteristics. I think is probably important. Does it actually relate to you as an individual? Because if they're all 65 and obese, and you're 30 years of age and not obese and training for an Ironman, maybe there's a little bit of difference there, and maybe what is being applied should be thought about.
I think it's uh, critical perspective there, and we don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but there's certainly performance experts out there on podcasts, etc., that are straying into having tendencies to do that, drawing from it and making conclusions to support their arguments. We will not name names, but unfortunately that does happen quite a bit. There's potentially ignoring a wealth of research, pulling one in a study to help them make their point that they want to make. But we won't go down that rabbit hole. We're going to we're going to go on to the next thing. Okay. This is an interesting one, actually. I think this is, and there may be more than one thing here, but this person's really interested in maximizing their daily energy. So this is less the athlete. This is another one that I know the person that asked me this question. So what's the number one or two things, and maybe the top couple of things that I can do to focus on my daily nutrition if I really want to maximize daily energy? How should I go about this? In a less of an athletic, this person's active. I'll give you that.
Well, look, the number one thing to focus on for daily nutrition is consistency. I think what needs to be applied to this question is understanding daily energy. Is this athlete or individual trying to lose body weight and lose body fat? Because if that is the case, then also mindset comes into this. Because if you are going to try and lose weight or lose body fat, you're going to have to be in a calorie deficit for a period of time, not necessarily a long period of time, but a period of time. And with that, probably is going to come some diminished performance and maybe some lower energy. And so I think understanding that and accepting that and embracing that to a degree is an important part of that focus. Now, I know that's could be controversial because people are like, oh, you're suggesting that people should just get comfortable being hungry. I'm not saying that, but I think you need to put it back to what are you trying to achieve? And just accepting that. Like, you're not going to smash out PBs on threshold sessions that Maddie gives you if you are in a calorie deficit. That's just going to be a given. It's not saying that you can't do those threshold sessions. It's just accepting that maybe performance might be a little bit lower than if you were carved up to your eyeballs. And so I think that is important to understand. So mindset, probably number one, and then consistency around what you're doing in order to maximize, your adherence and your energy around that nutrition. That's what I would be saying.
And is there anything else? Because this person's not looking for body composition changes; they're pretty stable. They're just hoping to stabilize energy in the day. Like, so they're sitting at their desk. Is there anything that they can do that would help with that?
Yeah, well, I mean, then it comes back to if are they potentially under consuming total energy
Hmm.
and total calories because they actually aren't concerned about body composition or losing weight, but they're actually not matching their energy requirements for the work that you're potentially prescribing to them. So then you want to look at that. Are you underdoing the energy? And is that the reason why they're actually feeling a little bit of a lull and low energy? Come back to question number one, where you get that mid-afternoon slump. Okay, how active are they in the
Hmm.
afternoon after eating? Do they go for a short walk? Do they do just a couple of push-ups or squats? Does that suddenly make them better? What's their caffeine consumption? And then sleep. How is their sleep? I think always, and again, is sleep nutrition? Nutrition certainly impacts sleep. Sleep impacts nutrition. How is their sleep, and is their sleep optimized in order to manage their day-to-day sort of energy sort of output? And so it's multifaceted. I think that is probably the important point of this. And to ask, what is the one thing you can do? No, I don't believe there is one thing. I think you've got to look at the puzzle of an individual, and for that individual to sort of look at their own puzzle and say, well, okay, Total energy, we covered. So, what is your nutrition? Are you taking in enough to sustain what you're trying to achieve? Is your sleep on point? 7 to 9 hours. Okay, fine. Minimum 7. But are you working really hard and training really hard? Maybe the minimum is 8 or 9 hours of sleep. And then the last thing is, how is your training? Is your training consistent? Is it full of lots of high intensity training, or is there a good balance between low and high, and able to get enough recovery between sessions with your sleep and with your nutrition? So that's probably where I sit with that. It's probably a convoluted answer, but
No,
one
no,
that
no. It's
I couldn't put into
I'm
as one
actually.
thing.
I have to say, I'm quite glad that you answered it like that, which was almost a refusal to answer it. So far as I give me the one thing, because it's exactly this. Actually, I was explaining to somebody today that might resonate with you, where we were talking about all of the sort of components that go into building what I like to call a performance-based layer. So, in other words, a platform of health and daily readiness to go and do whatever you want. Okay, showing up with good energy, ready to go and perform. And I was saying it is like a fabric of woven together of all of these parts. In other words, if we just quickly identify them, like your movement, your strength training, your sleep, your hydration, your daily eating habits, your fueling, all of these components, you can't just think about them as mutually exclusive. They all contribute together to create this really robust fabric. And so you have to go on a journey of transformation ultimately that takes time to work out where ultimately, pardoning the pun once again, getting your recipe right of all of these areas. So I'm really glad that that sort of bubbled up for me because you sort of started to bring in sleep and how that interacts with nutrition. It's exactly right. This all comes in together. So it's a great answer. That's it. We're going to move on so we can get through all of these. We've got 3 questions to go. They're compelling stuff so far. So let's go. This is another interesting one. This one's, I think, a little bit more of a simple answer. Does it matter how I distribute my macros? Your macros being, for listeners, your proteins, your fats, and your carbohydrates. Does it matter how I distribute them throughout the day, as long as I'm getting what I need in total over the course of a day?
It's a great question, and probably something we've talked about more recently because there's been some interesting studies come out, especially around protein. So I think as a hierarchy, if we're talking about principles, yeah, total amounts, total calories, total macronutrients is actually the most important thing an athlete should be focusing on. Now, when it comes down to spreading them out, the old thinking, especially if we talk about protein in particular, protein was pulsing it out throughout the day because that maximizes muscle protein synthesis and the ability to gain lean tissue or at least maintain it. More recently, there's been some cool studies where they actually overfed with large amounts of protein, say 100 grams of protein in a single meal versus, say, 25 and I think even 40. And what it showed was that very large bolus or that large amount of protein actually had very positive effects across the course of the day. And so, what it now redefines is actually if you want to eat a huge amount of protein early on in the day, you could do that. The caveat to this is if you if you try and eat 100 grams of protein, that's probably what 500 grams of chicken breast in the morning. Again, practically not very likely. Are you going to do it all with a whey protein supplement or a milk protein supplement? Wouldn't recommend it because it's not something that's sustainable. So the reality is spreading them out across the day becomes just a practical element of you enjoying breakfast, lunch, dinner, and then having a few snacks in and around training to maximize how you feel going into those sessions and how you feel afterwards. So, yes, the science now is leaning towards you could eat all your protein in one hit and probably benefit from it. However, from a practical standpoint, think about that. Think
Yeah.
about just pulsing it out because it's far more enjoyable to eat 3 meals a day, at least main meals, and then have some snacks in between to curb little things like hunger and make you feel good that you're eating and not on a strict diet. That's how we'd be doing it. From a carbohydrate perspective, again, total carbs, super important. But if you've got a long session, you sure as hell want to eat something before it. You're probably going to eat something afterwards to maximize recovery. And that's again how you should be thinking about your nutrition.